Chapter 1. You are listening at FameTV.info. Chapter 1. Swordsmanship Instruction Translator. Transin Editor. Transin in the Sword Marquis Mansion, Bahui Commandery, Tianyan Province in the Tianzong Dynasty. Menger, your sword can be faster and more powerful. Nice, that time was better. Jian Menger, a beautiful young girl wearing snow-white clothes, was practicing her swordsmanship diligently in the courtyard. The speed of her sword was fast. The man standing beside her and giving her advice was a young boy wearing black called Xuanhuan. Judging by their appearance, both of them were only about 15 or 16 years old. But Xuanhuan could already point out her shortcomings one by one with his perceptive gaze. After finishing a complete sword art, Jian Menger stood up, sheathing her sword. She smiled and went over to Xuanhuan. Bro Wuxuang, what do you think of my swordsmanship? Jian Menger asked. Aurora sword art requires high speed. If someone could finish the whole sword art within 40 breaths worth of time, they would be at the profound level. You just finished it within 38 breaths of time. That's quite good, Xuanhuan said. Thanks for your help. Without you I could not have reached the profound level in this short period of 2 months, Jian Menger said. Xuanhuan shook his head secretly. He knew that his instruction was part of it, but what was more important was that Jian Menger herself had great talent in the sword. In the Sword Marquis Mansion, where most people paid attention to practicing swordsmanship, perhaps Jian Menger was the one with the highest talent in swordsmanship, apart from himself. Bro Wuxuang, how long does it take you to finish the Aurora sword arts? Within 30 breaths. Jian Menger asked. Within 30 breaths. Xuanhuan smiled but did not answer her. Anyone who finished set of Aurora sword arts within 30 breaths worth of time would have reached the profound level. However, he could finish the whole set in 23 breaths of time if he went all out. That it meant that he had reached great heights long ago. With your talent in swordsmanship, you must finish it in less than 30 breaths, except. Jian Menger looked at Xuanhuan with hesitation and sorrow in her eyes. Xuanhuan certainly knew what she implied. He smiled and said, don't worry, I'll become a warrior soon. Really? Jian Menger was doubtful. After all, he had said that 4 years ago, Xuanhuan was the lineal disciple of the Sword Marquis Mansion. His father was the Sword Pavilion Master and he had been recognized as the most powerful in Sword Marquis Mansion. Xuanhuan grew up under his father's cultivation and instruction. Thanks to his father, he was born into a position of eminence and was absolutely one of the top young generation disciples in the Sword Marquis Mansion. However, all that changed greatly 4 years ago when he was 12 years old. During that year, his father had left to travel, but thereafter, he had not been heard from and no one knew where he was. Misfortune never comes alone. It was also in that year when he should have started to cultivate spiritual power, which was essential for him to become a warrior. However, he found that he could not cultivate spiritual power no matter how hard he tried. Failing to cultivate spiritual power was a nightmare for a warrior. It should be known that to practice martial arts, a warrior needed to absorb spirit from heaven and earth and then to cultivate spiritual power in his body. Spiritual power was fundamental to every warrior. It was impossible for one to be a warrior if one could not cultivate spiritual power. Such a person would be looked down as trash in the Sword Marquis Mansion, where strength was everything. During the last 4 years, Xuanhuan had never given up. Instead, he had continued to work hard to become a real warrior. He hoped to succeed his father's seat and be given charge of the Sword Pavilion one day. But reality was cruel. Although Xuanhuan could not cultivate spiritual power, his talent in swordsmanship was amazing. He practiced swordsmanship under his father's instruction since he was young. Because of his father's status and his great talent, he remembered sword arts quickly and could fully comprehend them after only being taught once. Though he was young, there was no doubt that he was number one in terms of swordsmanship, but it meant nothing to practice swordsmanship without spiritual power. It's real this time, Xuanhuan said confidently. Well. Jian Menger smiled, but did not take it seriously. Menger, Wuxuang. A kindly middle-aged man walked into the courtyard. Father, Jian Menger called out. Uncle Lan, Xuanhuan called out after. This middle-aged man was Jian Menger's father. the great elder of the Red Martial Hall in the Sword Marquis Mansion, Xuanhuan, Wuxuang, you have instructed Menger in swordsmanship all day. That's very kind of you, Xuanhuan smiled and said, it's nothing. Wuxuang shook his head and said, Uncle Lan, it's getting late. I'd better be off. Okay. Xuanhuan and Menger watched Wuxuang leave. As Wuxuang disappeared from sight, the mild look on Xuanhuan vanished. Menger, how much progress have you made? Xuanhuan asked her in a low and deep voice. In Aurora sword art, I have reached the profound level, Menger said with a stern look. Great. Xuanhuan held his hands with exultation on his face. For almost 4 years, you have been with that loser every day in order for him to teach you swordsmanship. After 4 years of suffering, you finally get something in return. Now you have learned all 18 first-class sword arts of the Sword Pavilion to the profound level. The next step is to carry out our plan. Father, are you sure that we can do it? Menger frowned and asked, as her eyes looked cold and merciless, those who are involved in a major event do not worry about trifles. Lan's eyes became cold and sharp again. All things depend on what happens tomorrow. Wuxuang went back to his own courtyard. After eating something quickly, he sat cross-legged on the bed. When I told Menger today that I would become a real warrior soon, she didn't believe me. Wuxuang smiled and his right hand involuntarily touched his lower abdomen. In his abdomen, a gray stone bead, which was the size of a baby's fist, had existed since he was born and no one knew where it came from, but it was the chief reason which prevented him from becoming a real warrior. Others thought that Wuxuang was a good for nothing who could not cultivate any spiritual power. Actually, only he himself knew that it was not true. The 108 meridians in his body were unblocked a long time ago. It was quite easy for him to cultivate spiritual power. However, the spirit that he cultivated from the heaven and earth was totally absorbed by the gray stone bead in his abdomen before it could turn into spiritual power. In other words, all the spirit that he cultivated from nature became food for the gray stone bead. While the gray stone was growing constantly, Wuxuang found that the bead was like a bottomless pit that had no limit to its volume. In the last 4 years, he had been cultivating spirit every day to fill the gray stone bead up as fast as possible, so that the bead would stop absorbing his spiritual energy, which would allow him to cultivate spiritual power in his body and become a warrior. Yesterday, he found that the gray stone bead would soon be saturated. By today, the gray stone bead would reach its limit. Then he could cultivate spiritual power in his body. Let me get started. Wuxuang started his daily cultivation and awaited the changes. Things went as he had expected. The gray stone bead in his body reached its ultimate limit while more and more spirit energy was absorbed. The gray stone bead suddenly spun in his body and the rotation was getting faster and faster, while it was getting smaller and smaller. Unexpectedly, the gray stone bead, which had existed in Wuxuang's body for such a long time, completely vanished with a tremble. It's gone. The bead disappeared, didn't it? A burst of great joy came into Wuxuang's eyes for 1 second, but the next moment, he suddenly opened his eyes wide. A rush of information flew into his mind. Heavenly creation skill. Form a supreme martial art with the technique of creation from heaven and earth. Listen to the full novel at FameTV.info, direct link in the description.